There is a question that has haunted rulers, leaders, and ordinary people for over 500 years. It is a question so uncomfortable, so deeply unsettling, that most people refuse to answer it honestly. And yet, the answer to this question has shaped the rise and fall of empires, determined the fate of revolutions, and decided whether leaders live to see old age or die at the hands of those they trusted most. The question is simple: is it better to be loved or to be feared? Most people, when asked this question in public, will say love. Of course, love. Love is beautiful. Love inspires loyalty. Love makes people want to follow you. Fear, they will say, is the tool of tyrants, the weapon of the weak, the last resort of those who cannot earn genuine respect. But here is what those same people will never admit. When they are alone, when no one is watching, when they think about the world as it actually is rather than as they wish it to be, they know the truth. They have seen it. They have lived it. The people who are feared get what they want. The people who are merely loved get betrayed. This is the most dangerous lesson ever written about power. It comes from a man who lived in Florence, Italy, over 500 years ago. A man who watched republics fall and tyrants rise. A man who was tortured for his beliefs, and then sat down to write the most controversial book on leadership ever created. His name was Niccolò Machiavelli, and his answer to the question of love versus fear has never been forgotten because it has never been proven wrong. Tonight, we are going to explore this lesson in its entirety. We are going to understand why Machiavelli believed what he believed, examine the evidence he used, and most importantly, discover whether his conclusion applies to our own lives. Because this is not just a lesson about kings and emperors. This is a lesson about you, about your relationships, your career, your ability to get what you want from life without being destroyed by those who smile at you while sharpening their knives. But before we can understand the lesson, we must understand the man. And to understand Machiavelli, we must first understand the world that created him. Florence in the late 1400s was not a city. It was an arena. An arena where families fought for dominance, where alliances shifted like sand, where a man could be celebrated as a hero one day and hanging from the gallows the next. This was the world of the Italian Renaissance, and it was simultaneously the most beautiful and most brutal period in European history. The great families of Florence, the Medici, the Pazzi, the Strozzi, they did not simply compete for power, they competed for survival, and the weapons they used were not just swords and poison, though there was plenty of both. Their weapons were also art, architecture, philosophy, and above all, the careful cultivation of public image. Lorenzo de' Medici, known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, understood this perfectly. He commissioned the greatest artists of his age, Botticelli, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, not simply because he loved beauty, though he did, but because art was power. A magnificent cathedral told the people that the Medici were blessed by God. A stunning sculpture told visiting diplomats that Florence was a city of culture and sophistication. And beneath all this beauty, the Medici built a network of banks, spies, and carefully placed allies that made them the unofficial rulers of a city that was officially a republic. Niccolò Machiavelli was born into this world in 1469. His family was respectable but not wealthy. They had status but not power. And young Niccolò grew up watching how power actually worked, from a position close enough to see everything, but too far to participate. This is crucial to understanding who Machiavelli became. He was not born into power. He had to observe it, study it, analyze it from the outside. And observers, people who watch without participating, often see things that the players themselves miss. They see the patterns. They see what actually leads to victory and what actually leads to defeat. They are not blinded by their own position in the game. By the time Machiavelli was 29 years old, Florence had experienced one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in its history. the Medici had been expelled. A fanatical monk named Girolamo Savonarola had seized power, promising to cleanse the city of its corruption and sin. For 4 years, Savonarola ruled Florence with the power of his words alone. He had no army, he had no wealth. He had only the love and devotion of the people who believed he spoke for God. And then, just as suddenly as he had risen, Savonarola fell. His supporters abandoned him. His enemies grew bold. And in 1498, the man who had commanded the love of thousands was hanged and burned in the same square where he had once held his bonfires of the vanities. Machiavelli witnessed all of this. He was 29 years old when Savonarola was executed, and in that same year, he received his first government position. He became the second chancellor of the Florentine Republic, a role that would send him on diplomatic missions across Italy and Europe for the next 14 years. These 14 years were Machiavelli's education, not in books, though he read voraciously, but in reality. He met with kings and popes, generals and merchants, saints and scoundrels. He saw how negotiations actually happened, how alliances were actually formed, how wars were actually won, and he began to notice something that disturbed him deeply. The leaders who succeeded, the ones who built lasting power, were not the ones who were most loved. They were not the most virtuous, the most kind, or the most generous. Often, they were none of these things. The leaders who succeeded were the ones who understood human nature as it actually is, and human nature, Machiavelli observed, was far darker than most philosophers wanted to admit. One of the most formative experiences of Machiavelli's life came in 1502, when he was sent as a diplomat to the court of Cesare Borgia. Now, Cesare Borgia was not a good man by any conventional definition. He was the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI, and he had built his power through a combination of military force, strategic marriage, and ruthless elimination of his enemies. He was accused of murder, incest, and countless other crimes. He was feared throughout Italy. And yet, when Machiavelli arrived at Borgia's court, he did not find a simple monster. He found a brilliant strategist who understood something that his more virtuous opponents did not. Borgia understood that being loved made you dependent on others, while being feared at others dependent on you. Machiavelli spent months observing Borgia's methods. He watched how Borgia dealt with rebellious subordinates, how he managed conquered territories, how he handled those who plotted against him. And one episode in particular made an impression that would last the rest of Machiavelli's life. When Borgia conquered the Romagna region, he found it in chaos. The previous rulers had been weak, and the land was filled with crime, corruption, and disorder. So Borgia appointed a man named Ramiro de Orco to pacify the region. De Orco was brutal. He used torture, execution, and terror to establish order, and it worked. Within months, the Romagna was at peace. But here is where Borgia demonstrated his genius. Once the region was pacified, Borgia knew that the people hated De Orco for his cruelty. If that hatred was allowed to fester, it would eventually turn against Borgia himself. So Borgia had De Orco arrested, tried for his crimes, and publicly executed. He even had the body cut in half and displayed in the town square with a bloody knife beside it. In one stroke, Borgia accomplished 3 things. He got the order he needed through De Orco's brutality. He won the love of the people by punishing the man who had been cruel to them. And he sent a message to every other subordinate that failure or becoming a liability would not be tolerated. Machiavelli was astonished. He had never seen power wielded so precisely. Borgia had used both love and fear, but he had used them as tools, not as goals. He had not cared about being loved or feared in the abstract. He had cared about achieving specific outcomes, and he had selected the appropriate tool for each situation. This was the beginning of Machiavelli's most dangerous idea. What if morality, what if love and fear and virtue and vice were not ends in themselves, but means to an end. What if the truly effective leader was the one who could use any of these tools, choosing whichever one the situation required? But Machiavelli's education was not complete. He had seen success. Now he had to experience failure. In 1512, everything changed. The Medici family, with the help of Spanish troops, returned to Florence and overthrew the republic that Machiavelli had served. Suddenly, the man who had spent 14 years as a respected diplomat and government official was an enemy of the state. He was arrested. He was accused of participating in a conspiracy against the Medici, and he was tortured. The method of torture was called the strappado. Machiavelli's hands were tied behind his back, and he was hoisted into the air by a rope attached to his wrists. The weight of his body would dislocate his shoulders, causing excruciating pain. He was dropped and raised, again and again. Machiavelli did not confess, because he had nothing to confess. He was not part of any conspiracy, but his innocence did not matter. What mattered was that the new rulers feared him, or at least did not trust him. And fear of what he might do was enough to justify his torture. Eventually, Machiavelli was released, not because the Medici believed he was innocent, but because a new pope had been elected. A Medici pope, and in celebration, political prisoners were being freed. But Machiavelli was not forgiven. He was exiled from Florence to a small farm in the countryside. He was forbidden from participating in politics. And at the age of 43, the man who had advised rulers and shaped policy was reduced to farming and poverty. It was during this exile that Machiavelli wrote The Prince. The circumstances matter. This was not an academic exercise. This was not a philosopher sitting in comfort, theorizing about power from a safe distance. This was a man who had been broken by power, who had seen everything he had built destroyed, who had been tortured by the very system he had served. And he sat down to write a book that would explain, with brutal honesty, how that system actually worked. The Prince is a short book. You can read it in an afternoon, but its impact has been enormous because Machiavelli did something that almost no writer before him had done. He described political power as it is, not as it should be. He stripped away the comfortable lies that rulers told themselves and their subjects. And he forced his readers to confront a truth that most people would rather ignore. The truth is this: in politics, in leadership, in any situation where power is at stake, good intentions are not enough. Virtue is not enough. Being loved is not enough. What matters is results. And the methods that produce results are often the methods that moral philosophers condemn. Now, we arrive at the heart of Machiavelli's most dangerous lesson. Chapter 17 of The Prince is titled Concerning Cruelty and Clemency, and whether it is better to be loved or feared. In this chapter, Machiavelli asks the question directly and provides an answer that has shocked readers for 5 centuries. He begins by acknowledging what every reader wants to hear. It would be best to be both loved and feared. A leader who is genuinely beloved by the people and also feared by his enemies is in the strongest possible position. No one would dispute this. But then Machiavelli makes a crucial observation. Being both loved and feared is extremely difficult, perhaps impossible to maintain over time. And when a choice must be made, when circumstances force a leader to prioritize one over the other, it is much safer to be feared than to be loved. Why? Because love and fear are fundamentally different in their reliability. Love, Machiavelli argues, is held together by a chain of obligation. When people love you, they feel that they owe you something, that they should repay your kindness and support. But this chain of obligation is extremely fragile. It depends on the continued goodwill of the people who love you. And the moment their self-interest comes into conflict with their love for you, the chain breaks. Machiavelli puts it bluntly. Men love according to their own will, but they fear according to the will of the prince. A wise prince should rely on what he controls, not on what others control. You cannot control whether people love you. You can control whether they fear you. Think about this for a moment. Consider your own life. Consider the relationships you have had, the loyalties you have expected, the times you were certain that someone would never betray you because they loved you. Now consider how many of those certainties turned out to be wrong. How many friends disappeared when you were no longer useful to them? How many colleagues forgot your contributions the moment they had a chance to advance at your expense? How many loved ones chose their own comfort over your needs? Machiavelli is not saying that love does not exist. He is saying that love is unreliable. It is not a foundation on which to build power, because it depends on the hearts of others, and the hearts of others are fickle, self-interested, and easily turned. Fear, by contrast, depends on something much more reliable, self-interest. When people fear you, they do not need to love you. They do not need to feel grateful or obligated. They simply need to believe that crossing you will cost them more than complying with you. And this calculation, unlike love, can be maintained indefinitely. But Machiavelli is not a crude advocate of terror. This is perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of his teaching. He does not say that a prince should be hated. In fact, he explicitly warns against this. There is a crucial distinction between being feared and being hated. And a successful leader must understand this distinction perfectly. Fear means that people believe you have the power and the will to harm them if they act against your interests. Hatred means that people actively want you to fail, that they are looking for opportunities to destroy you, that they will take risks and make sacrifices just to see you suffer. A prince who is feared but not hated is safe. His subjects will obey him because they do not want to suffer the consequences of disobedience. But they will not actively plot against him because they do not hate him enough to risk their own destruction. A prince who is hated, however, is never safe. No matter how much he is feared, there will always be someone willing to risk everything to bring him down. Hatred creates martyrs. Hatred inspires conspiracies. Hatred turns ordinary people into assassins. So how does a leader maintain fear without creating hatred? Machiavelli provides specific guidance. First, never touch the property of your subjects. People can forgive many injuries, but they never forgive being robbed. A man will more easily forget the death of his father than the loss of his inheritance. Second, never violate the women of your subjects. This was especially important in Machiavelli's time, when family honor was bound up with female virtue, but the principle remains relevant today. Any attack on what people consider sacred, any violation of what they hold most dear, will create the kind of hatred that cannot be controlled. Third, when cruelty is necessary, use it swiftly, decisively, and once. Do not stretch it out over time. Do not let it become a pattern that people can anticipate and resent. If you must cut deeply, and then stop. Let the wound heal. Let people's memories of the pain fade while their memory of the lesson remains. Machiavelli uses a vivid example to illustrate this principle. When Cesare Borgia conquered new territories, he used cruelty at the beginning to establish control. But once control was established, he became generous and mild. The people remembered the initial violence, so they feared him, but they experienced daily kindness, so they did not hate him. This combination was nearly unbeatable. Compare this to the approach of rulers who try to be kind at the beginning and then grow harsher over time. They win love at first, but then they destroy it. They never establish fear, and when they finally try to, they create hatred instead. Their kindness is forgotten, and their cruelty is resented. There is another dimension to Machiavelli's teaching that is often overlooked. He is not just talking about physical force. Fear can take many forms, and the most sophisticated leaders understand how to create fear without violence. Consider the fear of disapproval. In any organization, there are people whose opinion matters, whose approval is sought, whose criticism is dreaded. These people have power, not because they can physically harm anyone, but because others are afraid of losing their good regard. This is a form of fear, and it can be cultivated deliberately. Consider the fear of exclusion. Human beings are social animals. We need to belong. And the threat of being excluded from a group, from a community, from the circles of power and influence can be more terrifying than the threat of physical harm. Leaders who control access, who decide who is in and who is out, who can grant or withhold membership in the elite, wield enormous power through fear. Consider the fear of failure. In competitive environments, the possibility of losing, of being humiliated, of falling behind, can motivate behavior more effectively than any reward. Leaders who establish high standards and enforce them consistently create an environment where this fear shapes every decision. These forms of fear are subtle. They do not leave bruises. They do not create obvious victims, but they are just as effective as violence, sometimes more so, because they operate continuously, invisibly, embedded in the structure of institutions and relationships. Now, you might be thinking that this sounds manipulative, cynical, maybe even evil. And here is where we must confront the uncomfortable truth at the heart of Machiavelli's teaching. Machiavelli is not writing a book about how to be a good person. He is writing a book about how to be effective. And his observation, which has been confirmed by 500 years of history, is that these two goals often conflict. The world is not fair. Good people do not always win. Kind people are not always rewarded. In fact, in the arena of power, good and kind people are often exploited, manipulated, and destroyed by those who are willing to do what they will not. This is not a pleasant truth. It is not an inspiring truth, but it is the truth. And Machiavelli believed that facing the truth, however uncomfortable, was better than living in comfortable illusions that would eventually get you killed. He makes this explicit in The Prince. Many writers have imagined republics and principalities that have never been seen or known to exist, he says. But there is such a distance between how we live and how we ought to live that anyone who abandons what is done for what ought to be done brings about his own ruin rather than his preservation. Think about what he is saying. Philosophers and moralists describe ideal worlds where virtue is always rewarded and vice is always punished. But we do not live in that world. We live in a world where those who follow the rules are often defeated by those who do not. And pretending otherwise, clinging to moral ideals that do not match reality, is not virtue, it is naivety, it is suicide. At this point, you might wonder whether Machiavelli is simply a monster, a man who celebrates cruelty and counsels tyrants. But this interpretation misses something essential about his work. Machiavelli was a Republican. He believed that Republican government, where citizens participate in ruling themselves, was superior to princely rule. He wrote extensively in defense of republics, and his other major work, The Discourses on Levy, is a detailed analysis of how republics can be established and maintained. So why did he write The Prince? Why did he provide advice to the very type of ruler he opposed? The answer lies in his circumstances and his hopes. Machiavelli wrote The Prince as a gift to the Medici family, specifically to Lorenzo de' Medici, the grandson of Lorenzo the Magnificent. His hope was that this gift would earn him favor, end his exile, and allow him to return to public life. But there is another reason, perhaps more important. Machiavelli believed that Italy needed to be united. In his time, Italy was divided into small, weak states that were constantly invaded by foreign powers. France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire treated Italy as a battlefield, a place to fight their wars and extract resources. And Machiavelli believed that only a strong prince, willing to use whatever methods were necessary, could unite Italy and expel the foreign invaders. The final chapter of The Prince is a passionate appeal to the Medici to become this prince. It is called an exhortation to free Italy from the barbarians, and it is written in a completely different tone from the rest of the book. Gone is the cold, analytical detachment. In its place is patriotic fervor, almost desperation. Machiavelli is essentially saying, I have given you the tools, I have explained how power works, I have stripped away the comforting illusions. Now use this knowledge not for petty tyranny, but for a great cause. Unite Italy, save our people, make the suffering worthwhile. This context does not make Machiavelli a hero. It does not transform his advice into moral instruction, but it complicates the simple picture of Machiavelli as a celebrant of evil. He was a man who saw clearly, perhaps too clearly, and who hoped that clarity could serve a purpose beyond mere survival. Let us return to the central lesson and examine it more deeply. Why, exactly, does being feared outlast being loved? The first reason is temporal. Love is a feeling, and feelings fade. When people love you, they love the version of you they know at that moment. They love what you have done for them recently. They love the image of you that exists in their minds. But as time passes, memories fade. New experiences replace old ones. The love that seemed eternal becomes a dim recollection, easily displaced by new attachments. Fear, by contrast, does not require constant renewal in the same way. A single demonstration of power, if severe enough, can create a fear that lasts for years, even generations. Parents tell their children about what happened to those who defied the ruler. The fear becomes part of the culture, part of the assumed background of life. It persists even without regular reinforcement. The second reason is transactional. Love creates an implicit expectation of reciprocity. When people love you, they expect you to love them back. They expect you to prioritize their interests, to make sacrifices for them, to repay their devotion with devotion of your own. And when you fail to meet these expectations, as you inevitably will, their love turns to resentment, then to contempt, then to hatred. Fear does not create these expectations. People who fear you do not expect you to care about them. They do not expect reciprocity or fairness. They simply want to avoid your wrath. And because your obligations to them are minimal, you cannot disappoint them in the same way. They remain afraid, and you remain in control. The third reason is hierarchical. Love tends to equalize. When two people love each other, they become, in some sense, equals. They have claims on each other. They can demand things from each other. The lover is bound to the beloved, just as the beloved is bound to the lover. Fear preserves hierarchy. The person who fears is subordinate to the person who is feared. There is no equalization, no mutual obligation. The powerful remain powerful, and the weak remain weak. For a leader who needs to maintain authority over many people, this asymmetry is essential. But perhaps the deepest reason why being feared outlasts being loved has to do with the nature of human beings themselves. Machiavelli held a dark view of human nature. He believed that most people are fundamentally selfish. They pursue their own interests, protect their own families, and care about others only to the extent that it benefits them. They are grateful when it costs them nothing, and disloyal when loyalty becomes expensive. They are quick to promise and slow to deliver. They love you when you can help them, and forget you when you cannot. This is not a cynical view, Machiavelli would argue. It is a realistic one, and anyone who acts as if people are better than this is setting themselves up for betrayal. Consider what happens when you rely on love for your security. You trust people to remain loyal even when loyalty is not in their interest. You believe that they will remember your kindness and repay it in your time of need. You assume that the bonds of affection will hold when pressure is applied, and then the pressure comes. A rival offers your allies a better deal. Your enemies find weakness and exploit it. Circumstances change, and suddenly your allies must choose between their loyalty to you and their own survival. How many will choose you? How many will sacrifice their own interests for the love they once felt? Machiavelli's answer is very few, and those few are not enough to save you. Now consider what happens when you rely on fear. Your allies do not need to love you. They do not need to feel grateful or obligated. They simply need to believe that betraying you will be more costly than remaining loyal. And this belief, unlike love, can be rationally maintained regardless of circumstances. When the rival offers a better deal, they must calculate. Is it worth risking the wrath of someone who has demonstrated the power and will to punish betrayal? When enemies find weakness, they must ask, is this weakness real, or is it a trap? Will the feared leader truly fall, or will he recover and remember who abandoned him? Fear introduces caution into every calculation, and caution, unlike love, tends to favor the status quo. People do not risk their lives or their fortunes lightly. They do not make dramatic moves when the consequences of failure are severe. They stay in their place, obey the rules, and wait for a safer opportunity that may never come. Let us examine some historical examples that illustrate Machiavelli's principle. Consider Julius Caesar. Caesar was loved. The people of Rome adored him. His soldiers would follow him anywhere. His generosity was legendary, his charisma overwhelming. When he returned victorious from his campaigns, crowds gathered to celebrate him. He was the most popular man in Rome. And then he was murdered. On the Ides of March, 44 BCE, Julius Caesar was stabbed 23 times by senators who had once been his friends. Some of them had fought beside him. Some had received his pardon when they opposed him. They had witnessed his clemency, experienced his forgiveness, benefited from his generosity, and they killed him anyway. Why? Because Caesar's love-based power made him seem weak. His constant forgiveness suggested that there were no consequences for betrayal. His enemies calculated that the risks of conspiracy were low and the rewards were high. They were not afraid of Caesar. They had seen him forgive too many times. Contrast this with Augustus, Caesar's adopted son and successor. Augustus learned from Caesar's fate. He was careful to appear merciful and just, but he was not actually merciful to those who genuinely threatened him. He was ruthless when ruthlessness was required. He maintained a network of informers. He rewarded loyalty generously, but punished betrayal terribly. The result, Augustus ruled for over 40 years and died peacefully in his bed. He was not loved the way Caesar was loved, but he was feared in a way Caesar never was, and fear kept him alive. Consider another example, closer to Machiavelli's own experience. Girolamo Savonarola, the monk who briefly ruled Florence, was one of the most loved leaders in the city's history. His followers were devoted to him, with a fanaticism that bordered on worship. They believed he spoke for God. They followed his every instruction. They burned their own possessions in his bonfires of the vanities. And yet, when the tide turned, when the Pope excommunicated him and his enemies grew bold, those same devoted followers abandoned him. The crowds that had once celebrated him now gathered to watch him burn. The love that had seemed unshakable dissolved in months. Savonarola had never established fear. He had no army, no police force, no means of punishing those who turned against him. His power rested entirely on the love and faith of his followers. And when that love wavered, there was nothing underneath it. He fell from absolute power to public execution in less than a year. Machiavelli, who witnessed these events, never forgot the lesson. Unarmed prophets, he would write in The Prince, always come to ruin, while armed prophets conquer. Love without power is helpless. Fear without love is sustainable. This is not fair, but it is true. Consider negotiations. Whether you are negotiating a salary, a business deal, a diplomatic treaty, or a household dispute, the dynamics of love and fear apply. If the other party loves you, if they want you to like them, if they care about your opinion and your approval, you have power. Their desire for your love makes them willing to make concessions. But this power is unreliable. The moment they stop caring what you think, the power disappears. If the other party fears you, if they believe that you can harm their interests, if they worry about the consequences of displeasing you, your power is more stable. It does not depend on their feelings toward you. It depends only on their rational calculation of what you might do. The best negotiators understand this. They do not rely solely on charm or likability. though they may employ these tools. They ensure that the other party understands the costs of failing to reach agreement. They create fear, not of violence, but of missed opportunities, of public embarrassment, of future consequences. And this fear, carefully calibrated to avoid hatred, keeps the negotiation on favorable terms. At this point, we must address the obvious objection: is Machiavelli right? Does being feared really outlast being loved? Or has history proven him wrong? There are certainly counterexamples. Leaders who were genuinely loved, who built power on loyalty and affection rather than far, and who succeeded nonetheless. Gandhi comes to mind. So does Nelson Mandela. So do various democratic leaders who won elections through popular support rather than intimidation. But let us examine these examples more carefully. Gandhi was loved, yes, but the British were also afraid of him. They were afraid of the movement he had built, afraid of the international criticism that would follow if they were too harsh, afraid of the ungovernable situation that would result if they made him a martyr. Gandhi understood power perfectly. He used love as a weapon, but the weapon worked because it created fear. Mandela, similarly, was loved. But the apartheid regime did not negotiate with him because they loved him. They negotiated because they were afraid of the alternative: a civil war, international isolation, economic collapse. Mandela's brilliance lay in offering them a way out of their fear, a path to reconciliation that would avoid the catastrophe they dreaded. But fear was the foundation on which the negotiation rested. Democratic leaders are perhaps the strongest counterexample. They rise through popularity, through love, through the voluntary support of millions of voters. And they often maintain power without any fear at all, at least in the traditional sense. But democratic leadership is a special case. In democracies, the leader's power is not personal. It is institutional. The leader can be removed by the Constitution, by elections, by legal processes. The leader does not need to be feared because the system itself is feared. The system can imprison you, fine you, take your property. The system can destroy your reputation, end your career, exile you from society. The fear is displaced from the individual leader onto the institutions that surround them. This is, in fact, the genius of democratic government from a Machiavellian perspective. It creates sustainable fear without requiring the leader to personally be a figure of dread. The laws are feared, the courts are feared, the enforcement mechanisms are feared, and the leader benefits from this institutional fear without having to cultivate it personally. There is another dimension to Machiavelli's teaching that we have not yet explored. Throughout The Prince, he insists that effective leadership requires understanding the difference between appearance and reality. A prince, he writes, need not actually possess all the virtues, but he must appear to possess them. In fact, he argues, actually possessing certain virtues can be dangerous because it limits your flexibility. But appearing to possess them is always useful. This applies directly to the question of love and fear. The ideal situation is not to be feared while appearing cruel. It is to be feared while appearing just, even merciful. The most effective leaders create fear through their demonstrated willingness to act decisively, but they maintain a public image of fairness and benevolence. Consider how this works in practice. A leader who wants to be feared should not announce their fearsome qualities. They should not brag about their ruthlessness or threaten people openly. This creates hatred more than fear, and it makes enemies where none need exist. Instead, the leader should allow others to understand their capacity for severity through selective demonstrations. One well-chosen act of punishment, witnessed by many, can create fear that lasts for years. And between these demonstrations, the leader can be generous, accessible, even warm. The kindness makes the leader likable. The knowledge of what the leader is capable of makes them feared. This combination is devastating. People want to believe that the leader is good. They want to love them. They are grateful for every kindness and eager to interpret ambiguous actions charitably. But underneath this desire to love is the knowledge that disobedience, betrayal, or defiance will not be tolerated. And this knowledge keeps everyone in line, even as they smile and express their devotion. We are now approaching a fundamental question that Machiavelli forces us to ask ourselves. If he is right, what should we do? Should we become Machiavellians ourselves? Should we abandon love as a basis for our relationships and cultivate fear instead? Should we stop caring about being good and start caring only about being effective? This is where Machiavelli's teaching becomes truly dangerous, not because it might be applied, but because it might be misapplied. The first misapplication is to become needlessly cruel. People who read Machiavelli superficially often conclude that he is recommending cruelty, that being feared means being harsh, that successful leaders should cultivate a reputation for severity. But this is exactly wrong. Machiavelli explicitly warns against cruelty that serves no purpose, against the kind of brutality that creates hatred without creating respect. Cruelty, for Machiavelli, is a tool to be used sparingly and strategically, not a personality trait to be cultivated. The second misapplication is to neglect the importance of appearance. Machiavelli is not saying that you should be openly Machiavellian. He is saying almost the opposite. The effective leader appears virtuous, generous, merciful, and just. They create an image that invites love. But underneath this image, they maintain the capacity to act in ways that create fear. The appearance is essential. Without it, you become a monster that everyone wants to destroy. The third misapplication is to ignore context. Machiavelli was writing about political leadership in a specific time and place. Not everything he says applies equally to every situation. There are contexts where love genuinely matters more than fear, where trust is more valuable than intimidation, where the relationships you build will determine your success more than the power you wield. The question is not whether to be a Machiavellian or not. The question is when and how to apply Machiavellian insights. And this requires the kind of practical wisdom that cannot be reduced to simple rules. We have now spent considerable time with Machiavelli's most dangerous lesson. We have explored its origins, its reasoning, its evidence, and its implications. Let us attempt a synthesis. The core insight is this: love is unreliable. It depends on the feelings of others, and feelings change. Fear is more reliable because it depends on interests, and interests are constant. A leader who relies on love is at the mercy of those who love them. A leader who establishes fear can act independently. But this insight must be applied carefully. Fear without hatred is the goal. Cruelty should be used sparingly and strategically. Appearance matters as much as reality. The effective leader seems virtuous while maintaining the capacity for severity. The lesson applies beyond politics. It applies to business, to negotiation, to personal relationships, to any situation where interests, conflict, and power is at stake. Understanding how love and fear work gives you the ability to navigate these situations more effectively. But the lesson also carries dangers. Misapplied, it leads to needless cruelty, to the destruction of trust, to a world where no one can rely on anyone. The wisdom lies not in becoming Machiavellian, but in understanding when Machiavellian insights apply and when they do not. We have been exploring darkness for a long time now. Let us end with something more hopeful. Machiavelli's world was harsh. It was a world of constant warfare, of plague, of political instability, of the betrayal and assassination. In such a world, his advice made sense. When everyone around you is playing by ruthless rules, playing by kind rules is suicide. But we do not all live in that world. Many of us live in worlds where trust is rewarded, where cooperation is more valuable than competition, where long-term relationships matter more than short-term victories. In these worlds, Machiavelli's advice is less applicable. The challenge is knowing which world you are in. Are you surrounded by people who will reward your trust, or are you surrounded by people who will exploit it? Are you in a game where cooperation wins, or a game where only competition matters? Are the institutions around you strong enough to punish betrayal, or are you in a jungle where only strength protects you? These are questions you must answer for yourself. And the answers may be different in different areas of your life. You might live in a cooperative world at home and a competitive world at work. You might deal with trustworthy people in some relationships and predatory people in others. The person who understands Machiavelli can navigate both worlds. They can be genuinely loving and trusting where that is appropriate. They can be strategic and cautious where that is necessary. They are not trapped by either approach. They have the flexibility to adapt. This, in the end, may be the most valuable lesson of all. Not that you should be feared rather than loved. Not that you should abandon morality for effectiveness, but that you should understand how the world works well enough to make conscious choices about how you operate within it. Machiavelli offers you knowledge. What you do with that knowledge is up to you. 500 years ago, a failed diplomat sat in exile on a small farm outside Florence. He had been tortured, humiliated, stripped of everything he had worked for. He was poor, forgotten, convinced that he would never again play a role in the events that had once been his life. And in that exile, he wrote a book. A short book. Less than 100 pages. A book he hoped would win him favor with the very family that had destroyed him. A book that he dedicated to a prince who never acknowledged the gift. That book failed in its immediate purpose. Machiavelli never returned to political life in any significant way. He died in 1527, poor and obscure, having never seen the unified Italy he dreamed of. But the book lived on. It was copied, translated, debated, condemned, and celebrated for centuries after its author's death. It influenced kings and revolutionaries, philosophers and dictators. It changed how we think about power, about leadership, about the relationship between morality and effectiveness. And its central question remains as relevant today as it was in 1513. Is it better to be loved or to be feared? You now know Machiavelli's answer. You know why he believed it. You know the evidence he used and the reasoning he employed. You know the dangers of his teaching and the wisdom that can be extracted from it. What remains is for you to decide what to do with this knowledge. Will you become more feared? Will you remain content with being loved? Will you seek the difficult balance between the two? There is no right answer. There is only the answer that fits your circumstances, your values, your goals. Machiavelli gave us the tools. The choices are ours. This is the end of our exploration, but for you, perhaps it is a beginning of seeing the world more clearly, understanding power more deeply, and navigating your own life with greater awareness of the forces that shape it. Be careful with what you have learned. This knowledge, like all knowledge of power, can be used well or used badly. It can protect you from those who would exploit your innocence. It can also corrupt you into becoming the kind of person you once despised. The difference lies not in the knowledge, but in the person who holds it. Choose wisely.